at the table right now. They both gave opening statements this morning. They took questionings from Chairman Schiff, Adam Schiff, and the Democratic Council. Now they will be having questions from the Republicans as well. And it looks like Chairman Schiff is about to gavel the committee in. Let's go to the room.
Meeting will come to order. Chair now recognizes the ranking member or their counsel for the first round of their 45-minute questions.
Thank the gentleman. I want to get a few basic facts on the table of individuals that were involved in the 2016 election, just to see who you know and who you've met with. So I'll start with you, Mr. Holmes. Have you met with or do you know Alexandra Chalupa?
Thank you. Holmes, could you put your microphone on?
No.
Do you know Nellie Orr? You met with Nellie Orr? Bruce Orr?
No.
Glenn Simpson?
No.
Thank you. Same question for you, Dr. Hill. Do you know or have you met with Alexandra Chalupa?
No.
Nellie Orr?
No.
Bruce Orr?
Only in the course of my previous position as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia, where he attended some of the meetings that I presided over.
Years ago?
That's a long time ago, correct.
Glenn Simpson?
No.
Dr. Hill, in your testimony, you said that, in your deposition, excuse me, that Christopher Steele was your counterpart at one time. Is this correct?
That's correct, yes.
You testified that you met with Christopher Steele in 2016. I assume that's still correct?
That's correct, yes.
And the only thing we didn't get on that is, do you know about when that was in 2016 and how many times?
I'm afraid I don't. I actually had met with him, well, you asked me actually in the deposition when the most recent time that I had met with him in 2016. Mm-hmm. And he retired from the British Intelligence Services in 2009, which is the same time.
I'm asking about 2016.
2016, I don't recall, but I did meet with him sometimes before 2016.
But you don't remember the date?
I don't, I'm afraid, no.
Okay. You stated in your deposition that a colleague had showed you the Steele dossier before it was published. Who was that colleague?
That was one of my colleagues at the Brookings Institution.
And who was that?
That was the Brookings Institution President Strobe Talbot, who had been sent a copy of this.
And he shared it with you?
That was the day before it was published in BuzzFeed.
Thank you. You mentioned in your deposition also that you thought that it was let's get the exact quote, that the dossier was a rabbit hole. Is that still your testimony?
That's correct.
Do you know who paid Christopher Steele to generate the Steele dossiers? There were several of them.
At the time, I did not know. I understand from the media that it was through GPS Fusion. If that's not correct,
you know who was, and there was a law firm involved, but you know who the source of the money was?
I didn't at the time, no, I did not.
But do you know?
Well, now I've read it in reports, and thanks to your colleagues as well, that it was the DNC, as I'm led to believe.
And the Clinton campaign?
I don't know that for sure.
Okay. Mr. Castro.
Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. Hope you had some sandwiches or something delicious.
Hope you did too.
Dr. Hill, thank you for your service. Also, thank you for your participation in the deposition on October 14th, Columbus Day. We were with you most of the day, so I appreciate that. Mr. Holmes, thank you as well. You're a late entrant into this situation, and things sure did escalate quickly. We spoke with you last Friday night about what we thought was going to be a 30-second vignette about a 2-minute phone call, and it turns out you know, with your 40-minute opener today, you have a lot of information to share. So we appreciate you being here. Dr. Hill, your last day at the National Security Council was July 19th. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
So you were involved with the July 25th call, and you weren't involved with any of the relevant activities related to the pause and the aid?
I was not. That's correct.
And As of July 19th, did you believe that a call was going to be scheduled for the 25th?
I personally did not believe that it was going to be scheduled at that date, no.
And what was the thinking at the NSC as of July 19th about such a call?
Well, I've learned from other depositions, to be clear here, that perhaps there was some awareness that there might be a call. Ambassador Sondland, if you may recall, showed an exchange with the person who was taking over from my position, Tim Morrison, in which he indicated that there would be a call coming up. I was not aware of that.
Okay. Were you in favor?
There were differences, let's just say, obviously, in understanding about that call.
And were you in favor of such a call as of the 19th?
Actually, I was not, and I did say something about that in the opening part of the sessions today.
Okay. And how about Ambassador Bolton, to your knowledge?
Well, I know that Ambassador Sondland said in that email that Bolton was in agreement. To my knowledge, Bolton was not in agreement at that particular juncture, to my knowledge.
Do you know what his opposition was?
It was based on the fact that he didn't feel the call had been properly prepared, and as I said earlier, that we wanted to make sure that there was going to be a fulsome bilateral US-Ukraine agenda that was discussed, which is usual with these calls.
And were you surprised that a call ultimately was scheduled?
I was when I learned about it, that's right.
And did you have any communications with anyone back at your old staff about how that came to be?
I did not, know.
Okay. You did learn about the pause in the security assistance aid.
I learned about that on July 18th, so the day before I left, that's correct.
And there were several meetings about this, I believe you testified to?
I said that I knew there was going to be a meeting in that time frame, and there was one put onto the schedule for the following week, but of course I had left, and so I didn't attend that.
And is it fair to say that stops and starts in aid like this sometimes do happen?
That's correct.
And I believe you testified that there was a freeze put on all kinds of aid and assistance because it was in the process. At that time, there were significant reviews of foreign assistance going on?
That's also correct, yes.
And what else can you tell us about that?
About the foreign assistance review? As I understood, there had been a directive for a whole-scale review of our foreign policy assistance and the ties between our foreign policy objectives and the assistance. This had been going on actually for many months. And in the period when I was wrapping up my time there, there had been more scrutiny than specific assistance to specific sets of countries as a result of that overall review. And
at this time as well, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, they had become a little bit more involved with Ukraine policy?
Well, Ambassador Volker was always involved in Ukraine policy, at least since the beginning of his appointment as the special envoy for negotiations towards the war between Ukraine and Russia in Donbass.
What can you tell us about Ambassador Volker?
Ambassador Volker is an extraordinarily accomplished diplomat. I've worked with him in many capacities previously. You know his bio. He's been the ambassador to NATO. He's had a number of positions at the State Department, and actually I know him personally. So, you know, in the truth that we're trying to get at it, who knows who and who's met. I know Ambassador Volker really well on a personal level as well.
Okay. And you said he's a man of integrity?
That's correct.
And always acted in the best interest of the United States?
Absolutely, yes.
When did you first learn of Ambassador Sondland's involvement?
Well, it came in different ways. Ambassador Sondland, as the ambassador to the EU, had some perfectly logical involvement in the Ukraine portfolio. We work very closely with the European Union on matters related to Ukraine. The Ukrainian dialogue with Russia was in a format known as the Minsk process, which was led by the French and the Germans, and Ambassador Volker was trying to find out ways in which he could work closely with the French and Germans to move along on the resolution of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And obviously the European Union, as the umbrella organisation for Europe in terms of funding and assistance, was heavily active in offering financial assistance to the Ukrainian government as well as humanitarian assistance in the conflict. So it was perfectly logical that Ambassador Sondland would play some kind of role as our ambassador to the European Union.
Did you have any concerns when he presented himself to you as somebody with a major role?
I did at the time in which he presented it to me. This was after Ambassador Yovanovitch had been pushed out of her position. And it was at that juncture that Ambassador Sondland's role seemed to grow larger.
And did you express any concerns to him directly?
I did express concerns to him directly.
What were those concerns?
I asked him quite bluntly in a meeting that we had in June of 2019. So this is after the presidential inauguration, when I'd seen that he had started to step up in much more of a proactive role on Ukraine. What was his role here? And he said that he was in charge of Ukraine. And I said, well, who put you in charge, Ambassador Sondland? And he said, the president.
Did that surprise you when he told you that?
It did surprise me. We'd had no directive. We hadn't been told this. Ambassador Bolton had never indicated in any way that he thought that Ambassador Sondland was playing a leading role in Ukraine.
Right. I believe you used the term a large remit, that he characterized he had been given a large remit from the president.
I can't remember what I said, remit, but it was portfolio. He was constantly, these are all synonyms. He was talking to us about the fact that he'd been given a very broad portfolio by the president. He said his job was to go out and make deals in Europe. And as you know yourself, I listened to his testimony yesterday very carefully as well. He said that anything that had to do with the EU itself and the European Union member states was within his portfolio.
Right. We asked Ambassador Sondland about that at his deposition, and he conceded that he may have been spinning a little bit when he said that the president specifically gave him that role, and he indicated that his authority was coming at least a little bit more from the Secretary of State. At any point in time, was that related to you?
At different points, he mentioned talking directly to the Chief of Staff Mulvaney, and he also talked about Secretary Pompeo. But he was very, in fact, there were other people in the room in the meeting in which he asserted this to me, that it was the president who had put him in charge of this.
Were you encouraged, as of your last day in the office, that U.S. policy towards the Ukraine was headed in the right direction?
I was not.
And why was that?
Well, I was concerned about two things in particular. One was, again, the removal of our ambassador. And again, I will say for the record that the president has a perfect right to remove any ambassador at any time for any reason. But I was very concerned about the circumstances in which her reputation had been maligned repeatedly on television and in all kinds of exchanges. I felt that that was completely unnecessary. If the president wanted to remove an ambassador, which he did quite frequently, there was a number of ambassadors removed who were not political but career officials. That was done, but without these kinds of interventions. I wondered what that message was being sent. So there was that. And then on the second front, it was very clear at this point that there was let's just say, a different channel in operation in relations to Ukraine, one that was domestic and political in nature, and that was very different from the channel or the loop, however you like it, that I and my colleagues were in, where we were focused on bilateral relations and US foreign policy towards Ukraine. And these two things had diverged at this point.
In the run-up to Ambassador Yovanovitch's separation from post, did you have any communications with officials at the State Department about your concerns?
I did.
And who did you relate those concerns to?
I related those concerns directly to my counterpart, who was Acting Assistant Secretary Phil Rieker, who I know you've spoken to. I also spoke to David Hale in the context of larger meetings about many other issues. I mean, again, I covered a broad portfolio myself, and we often would talk about individual items. And I had private discussions with Deputy Secretary Sullivan, and he, of course, has appeared before committees here in the course of his nomination to be ambassador to Russia, and has spoken about that himself.
Okay. And you advocated to all those officials about your concerns about the information being spread about Ambassador Yovanovitch?
I did, that's correct.
The Trump administration changed courses from its predecessor and provided lethal defensive assistance to the Ukraine. Were you in favor of arming the Ukrainians with the javelins?
I was not initially in 2015 before I joined the government, and I'm sure that many people on the committee have seen that I wrote an opinion piece with a colleague at the Brookings Institution in that juncture, because I was very worried at that particular point in time that the Ukrainian military was not in a fit state to really take on board sophisticated weapons, be they defensive or offensive weapons. And I worried that there was not a long-term sustainable plan given the overwhelming force that the Russians could apply against the Ukrainians. However, when I came into government, in 2017 and started to interact with all of my colleagues in the Pentagon, and you had Laura Cooper here yesterday, I realised, in fact, that there'd been an awful lot of work done on this and that there was a clear and consistent plan for the sustainability long-term of the Ukrainian military. So I changed my mind.
Okay. And you're in fact one of the, I believe, the only witness that we've spoken to that has been able to articulate the opposition to providing the javelins. And as we understand it, during the Obama administration, the interagency consensus was, in fact, to provide the javelins, but they were not provided. Were you aware of the decision back then?
I was, and I think it was very much made on a political basis about concerns that this would provoke the Russians. Depending on how this was presented. And we were very mindful of that also when there were the discussions internally about the lethal defensive weapons inside of the administration.
Mr. Holmes, you're on the ground in Kyiv, and the javelins have now been authorized, provided. What's the view from the field, the U.S. Embassy, as to the effectiveness of the javelins?
They're an important strategic deterrent. They're not actively employed in combat operations right now, but the mere idea that were the Russians to advance substantially using certain kinds of armor, that the Ukrainians would have this capability, deters them from doing so. And it also thereby sends a very important symbolic message to the Ukrainian military that they have access to this high-end technology and that we trust them to do it. I'd only add also they've offered to buy some using their own funds. The initial tranche was provided through basically a program to do that, but they've now offered to spend their own money to buy more. So I think they think they're important.
And Ambassador Taylor has testified, Mr. Kent has testified that this is, in fact, the consensus of the interagency providing the javelins. Is it the, in your experience of working with Ambassador Taylor, was he also very much an advocate for this?
Yes.
Mr. Holmes, I want to go back to name some Americans. Now I want to talk a little bit about Ukrainian government officials. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with Sergei Leshchenko?
Yes.
Have you met with him?
I have.
He was a journalist, then he was in the parliament. Is he currently in the parliament?
Journalist again.
Journalist again. Are you aware that when he was in the parliament that he had provided information to a Fusion GPS operative named Nellie Orr?
I'm not aware of Nellie Orr. I'm not aware of who he provided information to. I'm aware that as a journalist, he's provided information.
Well, he was in the parliament at the time. This is in the 2016 campaign. He provided widely known as the Black Ledger. Have you ever heard of the Black Ledger?
I have. And
the Black Ledger, is that seen as credible information?
Yes.
The Black Ledger is credible?
Yes.
Bob Mueller did not find it credible. Do you dispute what Bob Mueller's findings were? They didn't use it in the prosecution or in the report?
I'm not aware that Bob Mueller did not find it credible. I think it was evidence in other criminal proceedings. Its credibility was not questioned in those proceedings, but I'm not an expert on that matter.
So the motivation for Leshchenko, as was reported to, was to go after a Trump campaign official and undermine Trump's candidacy. Are you aware of that?
If you mean by the release of the Black Ledger, I think Leshchenko's motivation was the same motivation he's always expressed, which is to expose corruption in Ukraine.
Right, but he's admitted motivation was to partly at least undermine the Trump candidacy that he did not support.
He has not said that to me. If he said that to you, I'll take your word for it.
And you're aware that you heard Dr. Hill's testimony, but the Steele dossier that contained that initial information that was fed in the FBI, were you aware that the Democrats had paid for that information?
So, sir, I never had any involvement directly with it.
I'm not accusing you of involvement. I'm just asking if you, not even if you knew at the time, but you now know today that the Democrats had paid for that information.
So I do want to be clear that all that happened before I arrived in Ukraine, so I don't have any firsthand.
Not accusing any involvement of you with the Steele dossier.
Understood, but I do want to be clear about that. And then in addition, I have read about those issues, but I'm not an expert on them.
But you're not disputing that the Democrats and the Clinton campaign were the source of funds that funded the Steele dossier.
I wouldn't be in a position to dispute that, sir.
Do you think it's appropriate for political parties to run operatives in foreign countries to dig up dirt on their opponents?
No.
Dr. Hill, do you think it's appropriate for political parties to pay operatives to dig up dirt on their opponents?
I do not.
Mr. Castor.
Turn to the President Zelensky's inauguration. Ambassador Volker testified that he was very pleased with the size of the delegation, although the vice president was unable to make the trip. Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland. And I understand, Dr. Hill, you were involved with some of the logistics and putting the delegation together. What can you tell us about the vice president's role in attending or not attending?
Well, I know that you've had the testimony of Jennifer Williams from the Vice President's office, and I defer to her as being much closer to the decision-making about the Vice President's attendance. I will say that I and many others hoped that the Vice President would be able to attend. And what I know from my perspective, because I was not involved intimately in discussions with the Vice President or his immediate staff, was that there were some questions about the schedule. As you all know, the President and Vice President can not be out of the country at the same time. And there were some questions about presidential travel in the same time frame. There was quite a bit of back and forth as to whether it would be really feasible for the Vice President in that time frame to go. So that was what I was aware of. I wasn't aware to the extent of the discussions that obviously Ms. Williams was involved in.
Right. The President was traveling in Japan, and then he was headed to Europe for the D-Day anniversary. The Vice President's office, according to Ms. Williams, provided 4 days, the end of May, the 29th, 30th, 31st, June 1st. And as it turned out, the Ukrainians decided, I believe it was on May 16th, to schedule the inauguration for 4 days later. And by this point in time, the vice president had been rerouted for a trip to Canada about the USMCA. And I just want to ask you whether you don't have any evidence that the vice president was encouraged not to attend for any other reason, do you?
I personally do not, but again, I defer to Ms. Williams.
And Ms. Williams' testimony was that she heard from the chief of staff's assistant that the vice president was not able to go. The leap, the reason for that was related to any of these investigations hasn't been fully established. I want to just note from the materials you provided for your deposition, there was a discussion whether President Orban may have influenced President Trump's decision on that May 13th day. And do you remember when the meeting was with President Orban?
I do.
When was that?
That was in May. That's correct.
So do you remember what time of day it was on the 13th?
To be honest, usually these meetings are around lunchtime, sometime in that time frame, in the kind of early to mid part of the day. Right. But I can't speak for sure, and I just want to be very clear that I cannot speak about head of state engagements. Okay.
Jennifer Williams testified that she learned about 11 or 11:15, and the meeting with President Orban was not scheduled until later in the afternoon. According to your schedule, it was right around 1:45. Is that consistent with your recollection?
Well, about the lunchtime time frame, yeah. Okay. Depending on when one has lunch, I guess.
Okay. But overall, given the 4 days notice, given Secretary Perry's involvement, do you think the delegation was a good-sized group?
I do, and let me also make a point that we don't try to make these delegations large. This is on the taxpayer's dime, and it's pretty expensive getting people there if you have to get military air, and we try to keep them small. If we had a longer lead time, perhaps we would have made other arrangements, but 4 days is not a lot of time to make an arrangement.
And Secretary Perry had become interested in some of the energy-related issues in the Ukraine.
I actually recommended that Secretary Perry be the lead, along with others.
And what can you tell us about his involvement in some of the Ukrainian policy?
Well, Secretary Perry's engagement in this made, again, perfect sense, given his role as Secretary of Energy, also his deep knowledge of the energy industry, his former governorship. Secretary Perry himself is an extraordinarily good advocate of U.S. interests, particularly in the energy sphere. And one of Ukraine's Achilles' heel, in addition to its military disadvantage with Russia, is in fact energy. Ukraine remains for now the main transit point for Russian oil and gas and pipelines to Europe. And this has been manipulated repeatedly, especially since 2006, by the Russian government. And in fact, many of you here will remember in the Reagan era, there was a huge dispute between the United States and Europe about whether it made sense for Europe to build pipelines from the then Soviet Union to bring gas to European markets.
Mr. Holmes, what was your view of the delegation? Do you think it was the right-sized group, right level of prestige to signal to the incoming Zelensky administration that the U.S. stands behind them?
I think it was fine in that regard.
Okay.
Since we're on the topic of Ukraine energy, I think it's a good way for us to segue into Burisma, which I assume both of you are familiar with. You've heard about it for many, many years. You're on the ground there now, Mr. Holmes. I know you weren't there, but at the time, but in September 2015, then ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, Obama-appointed career ambassador. I'm sure you know him.
I do.
Credible,
Yes.
successful ambassador, I'm sure. He called for an investigation into Zelensky, the owner of Burisma, president of Burisma. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. Did you know about Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Kent's concerns about the potential conflict of interest with Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma?
I would defer to George Kent, who was involved at the time and is an expert on those issues.
Did you know that the financial records show that this Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, routed more than $3 million to the American accounts of Hunter Biden?
I've heard that.
Were you familiar with that, Dr. Hill?
Only from newspaper reports.
Okay. Did you know that Burisma's American, and this is back to you, Mr. Holmes. Did you know that Burisma's American legal representatives met with Ukrainian officials just days after the vice president forced the firing of the country's chief prosecutor?
No.
Did you know that Burisma's American lawyers tried to secure a meeting with the new state prosecutor the same day the predecessor Victor Shokin's firing was announced?
No.
Did you know that Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Poroshenko at least 3 times in February 2016, shortly after the president and owner of Burisma's home was raided on February 2nd by the state prosecutor's office?
No.
Did you know that Devin Archer and Hunter Biden reached out to the Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, shortly after the raid on Burisma?
No.
So, Dr. Hill, did you know about, I don't want to go through and ask all those questions over again.
I also did not know. That's
You did not know about any of those?
I did not know, no.
Okay. So, you obviously know that the president had concerns about Burisma, had concerns about 2016 election meddling by the Ukrainians. When you were in there as the head of the Ukraine desk, did you ever raise any of these? Did you ever brief the president or raise it up to Ambassador Bolton about any concerns through 2017 and 18 that concerned 2016 election meddling or Burisma concerns?
The whole briefing process didn't really work in the way that you're suggesting there. So if the president had asked about any of this information, it would have been provided for him. Just to be very clear, Ukraine was not a top foreign policy priority in this period, in the same way that many other issues that we could talk about, from Syria to Turkey and others, are. So there weren't that frequent briefings on Ukraine. The briefings would take place when there was a scheduled meeting with a Ukrainian head of state. And as we know, there haven't been too many of those.
So just to, as far as you know, you did no briefings, no papers, answered no questions as it relates to the 2016 election or Burisma during your time there?
No, I did not know.
Mr. Castro.
And Dr. Hill, you told us during your deposition that indeed that there are perceived conflict of interest troubles when the child of a government official is involved with something that government official has an official policy role in, correct? I
think any family member of any member of the U.S. government, Congress or the Senate is open to all kinds of questions about optics and of perhaps undue outside influence if they take part in any kind of activity that could be misconstrued as being related to their parent or other family member's work. So as a matter of course, yes, I do think that's the case.
Getting back to Ambassador Sondland, you testified that every now and then he made a habit of name-dropping his interactions with the president.
That's correct, yes.
And I believe you also told us that there were instances where you would run into him on the campus and he would say, oh, I'm here to see the president, or I've been in to see the president, and you had an occasion to circle back and found out that wasn't the case?
That's correct.
And I just want to give you an opportunity. He testified about some sort of coffee he had with you on your last day, and I think when the deposition transcript was released, your counsel indicated that was completely fabricated on Ambassador Sondland's part, and I just want to give you an opportunity to address that.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, this is the federal government. We don't have coffee machines, readily in our office. If you'd come to my office in that time, the best I could have offered you was a cup of water from the water fountain outside of my office. Mm-hmm. So, the coffee that Ambassador Sondland and I shared was actually, we ran into each other, or rather he found out I was going to be there and then asked me to meet him for coffee in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in 2018 in August. So this is a full year before I left. That was a very nice coffee, so perhaps he, conflated those two meetings together. The meeting that he was referring to, he had come in to meet with our director for the European Union. This was in my last week in the office. And as I was in the office at the same time for a brief period before going into another meeting, and it was my last week in the office, we agreed to sit down with the director of the European Union, with actually Colonel Vindman, and the assistant that Ambassador Sondland had brought with him from the State Department. So there were actually four of us in that meeting, and unfortunately it wasn't over coffee.
And, he went on to indicate that you were upset, and you were upset with
Ambassador. Actually, there were 5 of us really in the meeting. Obviously, I can't do math, sorry.
Fair enough. He indicated you were upset, and you were upset with Ambassador Bolton and upset with the way things are going, and I believe your counsel said that was an outright fabrication.
Well, I think you might recall in my deposition on October 14th that I said that very unfortunately I had a bit of a blow-up with Ambassador Sondland, and I had a couple of testy encounters with him. One of those was in June 18, when I actually said to him, who put you in charge of Ukraine? And, I'll admit I was a bit rude, and that's when he told me the president, which shut me up. And this other meeting, it was about 15, 20 minutes, exactly as he depicted it was. I was actually, to be honest, angry with him. And, I hate to say it, but often when women show anger, it's not fully appreciated. It's often, pushed onto emotional issues, perhaps, or deflected onto other people. And what I was angry about was that he wasn't coordinating with us. Now, I actually realised, having listened to his deposition, that he was absolutely right. That he wasn't coordinating with us because we weren't doing the same thing that he was doing. So I was upset with him that he wasn't fully telling us about all of the meetings that he was having. And he said to me, but I'm briefing the president. I'm briefing Chief of Staff Mulvaney. I'm briefing Secretary Pompeo, and I've talked to Ambassador Bolton. Who else do I have to deal with? And the point is we have a robust interagency process that deals with Ukraine. It includes Mr. Holmes, it includes Ambassador Taylor as the chargé in Ukraine, it includes a whole load of other people. But it struck me yesterday when you put up on the screen Ambassador Sondland's emails and who was on these emails, and he said, these are the people who need to know, that he was absolutely right. Because he was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged. So he was correct, and I had not put my finger on that at the moment, but I was irritated with him and angry with him that he wasn't fully coordinating. And I did say to him, Ambassador Sondland, Gordon, I think this is all going to blow up, and here we are. And after I left to my next meeting, our director for the European Union talked to him much further for a full half hour or more later, trying to ask him about how we could coordinate better, or how others could coordinate better after I had left the office. And his feeling was that the National Security Council was always trying to block him. What we were trying to do was block us from straying into domestic or personal politics. And that was precisely what I was trying to do. But Ambassador Sondland is not wrong that he had been given a different remit than we had been. And it was at that moment that I started to realise how those things had diverged. And I realised, in fact, that I wasn't really being fair to Ambassador Sondland because he was carrying out what he thought he had been instructed to carry out, and we were doing something that we thought was just as, or perhaps even more important, but it wasn't in the same channel.
Dr. Hill, if you mind, sorry. Dr. Hill, I just want to drill down on this a little bit. The President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief, was concerned about the 2016 elections in Burisma. He had his personal attorney working these issues because he was under investigation by Robert Mueller's special counsel, partly beginning with an investigation that started with the Steele dossier that we've already established that the Democrats had paid for and had then fed into the FBI. So at the end of the day, the Commander-in-Chief, concerned about 2016 election meddling by Ukraine, sounds like you had just earlier testified that you weren't aware of that. But if that was the concern of the President, to try to get to the bottom of it, and it's the concern of Ambassador Sondland, who was trying to set up meetings on behalf of, to ensure really that meetings occurred and phone calls occurred to strengthen the relationship. I understand the people at the NSC, people at the State Department had issues with that, but at the end of the day, isn't it the Commander-in-Chief that makes those decisions?
My point, Mr. Nunes, is that we at the National Security Council were not told, either by the President directly or through Ambassador Bolton, that we were to be focused on these issues as a matter of US foreign policy toward Ukraine. So when you're talking about Ukraine in 2016, I never personally heard the President say anything specific about 2016 in Ukraine. I've seen him saying plenty of things publicly, but I was not given a directive. In fact, I was given a directive on July 10th by Ambassador Bolton very clearly to stay out of domestic politics.
And just for sake of the timeline, I think as of July 19th, they hadn't even engaged with Rudy Giuliani yet. I don't believe that happened until a little bit later. So you believe by July 19th they were already engaged in those types of activities?
We had already had a discussion with Kurt Volker, which was in the depositions of his assistant, Chris Anderson, that indicated that he had met with Rudy Giuliani at this point. And Ambassador Sondland made comments about meeting with Giuliani. And as we know, in the May 23rd meeting, they had been instructed to meet with Giuliani. Right. They gave us every impression that they were meeting with Rudy Giuliani at this point, and Rudy Giuliani was also saying on the television, and indeed has said subsequently, that he was closely coordinating with the State Department. Okay, so it was my belief that they were meeting with him.
Okay. And there's some ambiguity in the direction to work with Rudy Giuliani. Ambassador Volker said the president dismissed Ukraine and said, oh, if you want to work on it, just go talk to Rudy. And Ambassador Sondland took that a little bit differently. And I believe that Ambassador Volker was primarily the interlocutor with Mr. Giuliani, and that was happening didn't start until the end of July.
I only learned that subsequently from Ambassador Volker's deposition. So I just want to tell you, in that particular time frame, I was not aware of that. And in fact, Gordon Sondland did refer to Rudy Giuliani. And again, Ambassador Bolton had warned Ambassador Volker not to meet with Rudy Giuliani in a meeting.
Mr. Morrison told us both in his deposition and his public hearing that you had related concerns about Colonel Vindman's judgment.
I did not relate any concerns in general terms about Colonel Vindman's judgment, so I was somewhat surprised when I heard Mr. Morrison make that assertion and when I read his deposition. There was a very specific point that was made, and again, these are personnel issues, and I'm sure that nobody here would like to have their private personnel issues put before a committee, but you've asked me about this. So I had a couple of very short transition meetings with Mr. Morrison. And again, Mr. Morrison did not work in our directorate. He was taking over the position, which he held for 3 months. I had worked as the director, the senior director for Europe and Eurasia, it was at the time, for more than 2 years at this point, and I'd been working for a year with Colonel Vindman, with Mr. Vindman. And in the course of one of the meetings, sometime in the June timeframe, I sat down with Mr. Morrison and with a deputy, he referred to him in his deposition, John Erith, who was also working, and we went through our organisational chart. We went through who was staying, who was rotating out and leaving in the summer, and we talked about everybody's strengths and weaknesses. And I always asked my staff to do upward feedback as well, to talk about what I wasn't doing right either. I'd like to learn too. And I said that I was concerned about the way things were trending in Ukraine policy. So Colonel Vindman is a highly distinguished, decorated military officer. He came over to us from the chairman's office and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we were evaluating and looking at him in the context of what his future positions would be in the context of the US Army. And I was concerned that if, for example, Colonel Vindman might decide to leave the military, that perhaps he wasn't as well suited for something that would be much more political. I did not feel that he had the political antenna to deal with something that was straying into domestic politics. Not everyone is suited for that. That does not mean in any way that I was questioning his overall judgment, nor was I questioning in any way his substantive expertise. He is excellent on issues related to Ukraine, Belarus and Moldova, on Russian defense issues. He had been in charge of the Russia campaign, thinking through at the chairman's office and in the Pentagon. This was a very specific issue because by June we saw that things were diverging and you needed completely different sensitivity. Some people in my office have worked at the highest levels of advisory positions, and Mr. Morrison had come from Capitol Hill. He knew politics inside out, and we said that Colonel Vindman did not, and we were concerned about how he would manage what was becoming a highly charged and potentially partisan issue, which had not been before.
And Colonel Vindman related to us during his deposition that he subsequently was sort of cut out of a lot of the decision-making and involvements with the embassy in Ukraine. Was that something you recommended?
Not with the embassy in Ukraine. I mean, we did pull him back from the meeting in May in the Oval Office. Mm-hmm. And subsequently, we were very concerned about these political aspects to this. And we did not feel, when July 10th, Colonel Vindman was justifiably alarmed when he realized that there was this highly political aspect of the meeting that we were looking for eventually with President Zelensky.
And Mr. Holmes, I want to, at the end of August, we understand that Ambassador Taylor was engaged in obtaining some information for the president about European allies' burden sharing in the region as the decision about aid was being debated.
So, sir, after the hold was placed on the security assistance, and many people, I think, were scrambling to try to understand why. I believe it was Senator Johnson who had said the president was concerned about burden sharing, perhaps others as well. And so trying to interpret why this might have happened, and we were looking into the facts of what the Europeans have provided and what we have provided. It's very illuminating what we learned. The United States has provided combined civilian and military assistance to Ukraine since 2014 of about $3 billion plus two $1 billion loan guarantees. That's not, those get paid back largely. So just over $3 billion. The Europeans, at the level of the European Union plus the member states combined since 2014, my understanding, have provided a combined $12 billion to Ukraine.
And you were able to communicate that information back at the end of August?
I believe so. Yeah, this was done in collaboration with other missions, to the EU, to NATO, and others. Yes.
And do you think that was the information the White House was looking for?
We don't know. If the concern was that that others weren't spending as much as we were to support Ukraine, then that information showed a different story.
Okay. And the aid was subsequently lifted. The pause in the aid was lifted shortly thereafter.
It was in early September, mid-September.
Go back.
That concludes the 45-minute rounds. We'll now go to member questioning. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes.
So that has concluded, as
First,
we
as
just
a
saw
threshold,
the
however,
Democrat and Republican questioning from the counsels and the chairman of the two witnesses today, Fiona Hill and David Holmes. And we just saw in that questioning from the Republican counsel, Stephen Castor, Fiona Hill, some compelling testimony right there where she spoke about an encounter with Ambassador Sondland when she suddenly realized that she and Ambassador Sondland and others in the administration were embarked on two entirely different tasks, that he was on, according to her words, a domestic political errand. She and her colleagues on the National Security Council were pursuing American foreign policy, U.S. national security, and she says she told him, I think this is all going to blow up. I want to go to Mary Bruce, our senior congressional correspondent. And Mary, that encounter, I'm not sure that's what Stephen Castor expected when he brought the question.
No, George, it seemed as if Castor was going down this line of questioning to almost try to undermine some of Sondland's testimony from yesterday, but it clearly backfired. Look, Fiona Hill, visibly very frustrated in trying to retell what she was encountering as she was simply trying to do her job. And she got to the heart of the concern here, which is that there was this official channel and official directives as to what they were trying to do in Ukraine, and she was coming up against this other unofficial channel that was being run by the president's allies at the directive of Rudy Giuliani. And she says that she had this kind of testy exchange that they were trying to have her recount with Gordon Sondland when she realized that they were on two completely separate paths, and that while she was working on what she had been told to pursue in Ukraine, Gordon Sondland, she came to realize, was simply running a domestic political errand.
And Barbara Comstock, you actually had the job, a similar job to what Stephen Castor had during the impeachment of Bill Clinton back in the late 90s. Of course, you're also a former Republican member of Congress. Assess the questioning of the last hour.
Well, I think Dr. Fiona Hill owned that questioning, and I think Mary's right. That was not expected testimony, but what Fiona Hill has done so well is she has tied together all the different storylines that have been going on, because she now understands the fuller picture as she's been listening to the testimony over the past 2 weeks, and she's bringing that right in to the president and Rudy Giuliani and explaining these different operations that she's really probably only come to understand now as she's seen all that testimony. But I thought she was very effective. She obviously knows her topic, and she has a very good memory of all these events and how they melded together. And I think she validated the testimony of Sondland, of Vindman, and of others that I thought maybe they were trying. I think the Republicans were trying to maybe undermine some of the other witnesses, and instead she explained why their testimony was accurate in light of this bigger picture that she's now explaining.
And John Carl, thank you, Barbara. She also lifted something of a veil on how policy is made in this White House.
She sure did. There is a national security process that has worked as long as I've been covering politics in Washington, a process that includes the Defense Department, the State Department, the National Security Council making recommendations, going through what they call an interagency process, and then recommendations to the president, who then makes a decision. It's clear that that still exists in the Trump White House, except it exists side by side with a separate track that, in Fiona Hill's telling, seems to be directed right directly through the president, entirely separate from the foreign policy experts that are supposed to be doing it.
And Cecilia Vega, it was so interesting. Fiona Hill's so blunt. She talked about being rude. at times. She talked about showing anger and then had that revealing comment, when women show anger, it's often attributed to emotional issues.
Yeah, exactly. And I think some of the headlines about this will be questioned today. Some of them saying that Fiona Hill chastised members of Congress. She meant business. She was extremely smart. She knew exactly what she needed to do today. And I really think the takeaway from her testimony is not going to be her demeanor. It is going to be what she said in there, that what we are watching on Capitol Hill right now is exactly what Russia wanted.
And David Muir, when you take a step back now over the last week, one of the things Americans have seen, if they've tuned into these hearings, is the state and the quality of people working in the professional American Foreign Service.
I think no question about that, George. And in fact, what she did, though, as this sort of career expert in Russia who's worked for multiple administrations, both Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, is she, I think unknowingly for the Republicans who were doing the questioning there, is she backed up the hand-picked ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, by President Trump, this donor, obviously, to the inauguration, by acknowledging this other channel, which was so frustrating. She said it explained my anger in that moment. She said, when I was angry about who put you in charge of Ukraine, he said the president, which shut me up. Very honest when she said that. But then she said, when I listened to his deposition yesterday, and he talked about his chain of command, that I briefed the president, I briefed the chief of staff Mulvaney, I briefed Secretary Pompeo, I've talked to Ambassador Bolton. Who else do I have to talk with? She said it became very clear to her. She now knows where her anger was coming from because there was this alternate channel, and she also did something else. She acknowledged in her testimony today what Sondland said yesterday, which was that people were in the loop. So not only did she back up there were two channels, she's also made the point today in referencing what Sondland said yesterday, that there were a number of people, high-ranking officials in this administration, who knew exactly what was going on.
Everyone knew, even if they were at odds with what the president was trying to do. Terry Moran, on this point of watching the American Foreign Service at work.
It's a distinguished group. You are absolutely right. To see the quality of people and the dedication and the giving of their lives to the service of the country is, I think, for many people watching, almost a relief, ennobling in a way. But for many others, that same establishment is one that has brought decades of unending war, fought mostly by people from some zip codes and not from other zip codes in the country. And there has been, for many years now, a collapse in the faith and the trust in that establishment. And really, we are seeing it once again playing out. That other channel that Fiona Hill talks about, that was at the direction of the person put in the presidency by people who have no confidence anymore in the media establishment, the financial establishment, the foreign policy establishment. And the question in this entire impeachment inquiry is, will they give the president a break for departing from those channels and freelancing what Fiona Hill called his own domestic political errand?
And that's my question for our legal analyst here. Melissa Murray, let me begin with you. And I want to pose a question that I posed to Dan quite earlier this morning, because if you take a step back, if you look at the weight of the testimony over the last week, the public evidence, there's a pretty clear fact pattern right here. The president wanted Ukraine to announce political investigations. He froze their aid, wouldn't agree to a White House meeting until Ukraine announced those investigations, directed Rudy Giuliani, Gordon Sondland, and others to get that announcement from Ukraine. And then that all fell apart when the whistleblower complaint reached Capitol Hill. The aid was released. So given that fact pattern that we've seen over the last 8 days, have the Democrats made the case for impeachment by laying out that fact pattern?
Well, that really depends on if you think impeachment is a legal process or a political process. As a legal matter, they have laid out startling amounts of evidence showing everything the whistleblower said happened and corroborating it. And it's a clear case of impeachable conduct. I think that's full stop. On the political side, though, for the middle of the country, as Terry's referring to, this is just more of the deep state working against a disruptive president who is put in office for the purpose of being disruptive, and they may find that to be of no moment. So the real question here is, have we changed hearts and minds over the last week?
On the political side.
On the political side.
When you say they made the case for impeachment on the legal side or the quasi-legal side, on bribery, crimes and misdemeanor, high crimes and misdemeanors.
Well, so this goes back to the colloquy I had with Governor Christie the other day. Governor Christie's exactly right. The withholding of the meeting doesn't qualify as an official act for purposes of the bribery statute, but the framers didn't have the bribery statute in mind when they talked about treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. They were thinking of bribery in the common law sense, and in the common law sense, bribery could be about the abuse of your office, the misconduct and misdeeds of public men. Much broader, much more in keeping with this. Withholding the aid, I think, would fall squarely within the domain of the bribery statute, but it doesn't have to be impeachable.
And to follow up on something that you said about laying out the fact pattern, it did seem by the question from Representative Nunes that he was almost conceding to some degree, yeah, the president wanted 2016 investigated.
I was surprised by that.
Right? I mean, and he was basically admitting that, yeah, this is what he sent Rudy Giuliani out there, in effect, to go do that. And if that's the policy that he wanted to implement, then there's nothing wrong with that. And that's true. But up to this point, they haven't been admitting that. Up to this point, we keep hearing, no, that's not what was happening. Maybe Rudy was freelancing. We don't have any evidence that it came from the president. But it sounded just right there a moment ago like he was saying, yeah, it did. And if that's his decision, that's okay. And the response from Dr. Hill was, well, that would be fine if someone had told us. Meaning, I'm not trying to tell you what the policy should have been, but I'm there to implement it.
It also gets at something else that's been broadly playing out over the last week or so, or actually through this whole episode. For the Democrats who have to make the case, they need to have a laser-focused case that is convincing to people. It's perfectly reasonable in some ways on a political level for Republicans to have a variety of different arguments thrown up against the wall, even if they do conflict.
Yeah, I mean, sure. And look, you see that in trials all the time. Is the defense will throw up a bunch of different theories and say, well, you can't prosecute for this reason, you shouldn't convict for that reason, et cetera. And that may be the case. But one of the overriding themes we keep hearing day in and day out in these proceedings has been there is no evidence that the president was the one telling Rudy Giuliani to do this. I mean, that's all we heard yesterday was there is no evidence that it was the president who instructed it. And it sure sounded like that's exactly what Representative Nunes was just suggesting.
And Pierre Thomas, just remind people, though, this impeachment inquiry is going on. It's likely to go on the Judiciary Committee, probably the floor of the House, and a trial as well. But it's running in parallel tracks with this legal process in the Southern District of New York, where those associates of Rudy Giuliani have already been indicted. Some question about whether some of them will end up cooperating with the Southern District. And, of course, Rudy Giuliani is still a target in some fashion, not in the legal sense, but we know he's being looked at by the Southern District.
Well, George, there's absolutely a convergence. The investigation in the Southern District, in part, is about how Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, two associates of Rudy Giuliani, were engaged in a process to get rid of, to remove Marie Yovanovitch, who was then the Ukrainian ambassador from the United States. That is a part of that investigation. The investigation is also looking at some campaign finance violations, which those two associates have been indicted for, and they're trying to follow the money. And one of the key things, George, is that they say the Fruman and Parnas were directed to get rid of Yovanovitch by a Ukrainian official. So the government is trying to figure out who was that Ukrainian official? Was there foreign money involved? All of these things we're going to find out some answers to, George.
And John Carl, while this hearing is going on, the president's shoring up his politics.
He sure is. The president has portrayed this as an effort by Democrats to overturn an election. This is what you're going to hear from him over and over again. But George, as we discussed earlier, make no mistake, this bothers him, the prospects that he is facing impeachment in the House.
And he's got senators at the White House this afternoon?
He's got 10 senators dining with him at the White House. This is the fifth time in the past 5 weeks, in other words, while all this has been playing out, that he has had Republican senators over for lunch at the White House.
Okay, thank you all very much. We're going to return now to our regular programming. You can keep watching our live coverage of this impeachment hearing. You can go to ABC News Live. That's our 24/7 streaming channel. And, of course, David Muir will be back on World News Tonight later tonight. Have a good afternoon.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Live from ABC7, this is Eyewitness News.
Right now on Eyewitness News at 11 a.m., take a look at that. We are tracking all of the snow and the rain right now. We're going to tell you where it's hitting and where it is heading next. Also, the search is on for a pursuit suspect who led police on this wild chase in the San Fernando Valley. Authorities say they were following him in the first place. And we're also continuing to follow the latest developments right now in the impeachment hearings against President Trump. More on this morning's testimony. Hello, I'm Brandy Hitt. Welcome to Eyewitness News at 11 a.m. We do begin with the weather and where it is raining and snowing still right now at this hour. Let's check in with Brianna Ruffalo with the latest on that forecast. Hey there.
Yeah, a little different than yesterday. It's definitely calmed down. We're seeing most of the activity in Orange County this morning and down near San Diego. That's where we're seeing most of it. Still just a few little sprinkles out there in some spots and barely any snow right now, just at the very, very high elevation. So it's definitely calmed down. But take a look at this Big Bear, 36 degrees right now. We're seeing quite a bit of snow there, and we did see that yesterday from this system. We saw a decent amount of rainfall and snowfall totals, and we'll go over those a little bit later. I just want to let you know what you can expect today. Possible to see just a sprinkle out there, light shower throughout the afternoon. We're seeing partly cloudy skies, some sunshine though, and just cool temperatures. It's pretty cool out there. We're going to be about 10 degrees below our average for this time of year. We'll go over more of this and when we can expect the next chance for rain coming up in just a little bit. Brandy, back to you.
Yeah, what a great